Friends, we are here today with Dr. Eduardo Mendieta. He teaches at Stony Brook University, where he directs also the Department of Philosophy. He's the author of several books and translator of several books also of Henrique Dussel into English. And we are delighted to have you here, Dr. Mendieta, with the postcolonial networks. So let me start by asking you, so what do you think is postcolonialism?
Well, first, Claudio, thank you for this invitation and the opportunity to talk to you. Postcolonialism can be considered at the very least three things. First, it was a social movement, it was a political movement. It had to do with the crisis of European empires. And so postcolonialism is the political, cultural, economic aftermath of that. Nations creating their own nation states and trying to achieve their own sovereignty. So it's a movement. It is also an ideal, an ethical political ideal, whereby nations that were formerly colonies tried to develop their own cultural identities, that tried to create their own futures independent of colonial dependencies. And it is also a way, it's an epistemic tool. So it's three things: a political movement, an ideal to strive, and also an epistemological tool, a tool of analysis that helps us understand how there are certain kinds of enduring inequalities, certain kind of epistemic habits that prevent us from seeing how the ways in which we ask questions have been framed by colonialism and imperialism. So it's many things at the same time. And I think that the fruits of it, we are just beginning to reap in terms of what it allows us to do. I think that the most important thing that postcolonialism allows us to do is to challenge certain conceptions of world history and national histories in order to open up the future of possibilities. I think that postcolonialism allows us to challenge the ways in which a certain kind of past frames the kinds of questions we ask about the futures that we want to construct collectively. And I think this is one of the most important consequences that postcolonialism allows us to elucidate.
And is there a difference between doing postcolonialism, for instance, in Asia or Africa or Latin America or even here in the United States?
Right. One of the things that postcolonialism or decoloniality movements allow us to do is to really pay attention to the local histories. If only just because, well, one of the things that postcolonialism allows us to do is to provincialize the histories of Europe itself. I think that one of the things that imperialism does is to naturalize, to make uncircumventable, to say that this is the only path of history in order to justify empire. So when we begin to historicize, to denaturalize imperial histories, what emerges is a series of very different histories of empire building with different layers of race, class, gender. And so postcolonialism in China or Japan is going to be very different from the colonialism that we see in India, where there was layerings and conflicts of religions, but also caste. And it's going to be very different from what happened in Africa. And similarly, postcolonialism in Latin America is going to take a very different character. So I think that one of the things that postcolonialism allows us to see is the plurality of histories and their interconnections, but also their pluralities, and that they cannot all be reduced to some historical patron or some historical chronology.
So then how is that postcolonialism can relate to time and space?
Right. I have coined a term, I coined the term chronotopology. and maybe I'm not the first that used it, but I use it as a way to describe what happens with certain historical narratives. The fact is, when we look at the standard accepted canonized narratives, such as those we find with Augustine, such as those we find with Kant, that's the ones that we find, for instance, in Hegel and even Marx, they're so-called historical narratives that nevertheless assume a certain kind of mapping of history. So, to use this wonderful expression by Adrienne Rich, an American poet, she says that a place on a map is a timing history, and conversely, a timing history is a place on a map. And so I'm interested in the ways in which time and space are interacting, how certain spaces are considered savage, uncivilized, and how others are considered as the pinnacle of civilization, and the whole conception that progress culminates in a certain locale. So the narratives that we find about modernity, for instance, they're developmental narratives. They're narratives about progress and how things are unfolding in reason in society. But they're actually maps that justify the notion that Europe is the forwardmost point in history. So I'm interested in disaggregating or demonstrating the ways in which certain historical narratives condition the ways in which we see time. I mean, the greatest one, the greatest example of this is Hegel's conception that history begins in the East and culminates in the West, bypasses Africa, and America is the land of the absolute future, obviously of the future of Europe. And there we have chronology mapping space. So I'm interested in challenging and unmasking these power effects. So chronotopology is a way to ask, what is the relationship between a certain historical narrative and the way in which spaces are made uninhabitable or empty or primitive or uncivilized? And conversely, how the highest stages, so-called highest stages of human civilization are immediately assumed to take place in places like Berlin, Paris, London, but never New Delhi, Mexico City, or Rio de Janeiro, right?
Then taking that into account, and so how can we understand globalization then? What is globalization from that perspective?
From that perspective, globalization is just another imperial narrative, because globalization is generally thought in terms of certain kinds of processes that tend to be about the unification of the planet in terms of economy, technology, politics, and perhaps society. And obviously, or perhaps not always obviously, globalization is driven by the impetus of Europe and the United States. So it's a self-serving, self-advantageous narrative that, insofar as it's thought of as to be a process of technology and the intricate interlinking of the globe through networks, mostly determined by the West and the United States, then we are disallowed from asking the question, are these the ways in which we should be interdependent? Or are these relationships of interdependence mutual? Or are there other ways, perhaps, of being interdependent? What are the criteria? So, along with Enrique Dussel, I have, instead of talking about globalization, talked about planetarization. I think that another problem with the term globalization is that it makes it sound as though it is one process, there is one globalization, and it is a globalization that does not include the Earth. So it immediately effaces the fact that we are being made interdependent in many ways, not simply economically, not simply technologically, but also ecologically. I think that before there was economic and political integration, there was an integration of certain kinds of imaginaries. The women's movement, the ecological movement, the peace movement. These were movements that helped us come together even before we have this internet that facilitated economic integration. So that's the critique. And then the last point that we're trying to highlight by shifting to the concept of planetarization is that human institutions not only affect humans, but the entire planet. And so the perspective should be from the standpoint of the planet that belongs to all, rather than to certain privileged sectors of certain areas of the planet.
I see.